Welcome to the Critical Media Studies Podcast. We're your hosts, Mike Rapici
and Barry Falk.
Hi, Michael. How are you doing?
Hey, Barry, I'm well. How are you?
I'm doing well. You say that you're well, but you're being stoic and heroic. You just went through a storm situation.
Well, yeah, it was the back-to-back Helene
Back-to-back
Milton
storms.
combo was a lot here in Central Florida, but we're good. Made it through.
We're good, and we're ready to talk about, excuse me, Sarah Kember and Joanne Zylinska's essay. This is part two. This is our second episode on a book chapter by Zylinska and Kember. The book chapter is called Mediation and the Vitality of Media. And I think maybe before we promised to talk about the argument, the major argument in section 2 of the essay, to sort of bookend and close out our discussion of part 1 of the essay. So I'm going to try and give a summary of some of the material they covered last time. And Dr. Rapici is going to help me sort of fill in the picture. But this would be my sort of quicker, down and dirty précis of Kember and Zylinska. Can one have a down and dirty précis of a chapter called Mediation and the Vitality of Media? I don't know.
We are about to find out.
We're about to find out.
About to find out.
But the quick and dirty précis would be this, that they're addressing, and we think they're doing it in a really intelligent, in a comprehensive and ambitious way, and also a very intelligent way. The purpose, especially of the first part of the book chapter, is to walk through the history of media studies, really. And in the history of media studies, they identify certain intellectual problems. I think the academic word would be binaries. And in binaries that structure and slightly twist media studies. And in the tried and true dialectical Derridian manner, they're trying to find a way, they're trying to articulate a third position. And that's actually what we're going to be talking about today. Their articulation of a third position that overcomes certain binaries that they argue very persuasively structure the field. So what are some of these binaries? I'll name two, and you tell me if you think this is a fair. I think this covers their discussion, and I hope is a fair representation of their book chapter. Okay, so one of the major binaries or divides or impasses, maybe, binary for Kember and Zylinska, constitutes an impasse in the field, and they're trying to overcome it. So one of them is what they call the temporality of media, which they feel that most media studies has a particular formula for talking about media. And they're consciously and unconsciously, that most media scholars, consciously and unconsciously, and this would be especially true in the 60s and 70s, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, in the fledgling years, in the early years of the field, there was a tendency to think of new media as replacing, supplanting, wholly improving, and even if not technologically improving, certainly conceptually invalidating, rendering old media outmoded. And their concern, this is, I think, their first major concern, the first impasse that they want to target and overcome, is this temporal frame for thinking about media development, so that new media is always the better evolution, the next evolutionary step in media is always the better step in media.
Right.
That progressive ideology, that progressive notion that says the new is always better.
It's an optimistic take, really, right? This idea that progress is always or the time is progress, that the two are synonymous.
Right.
And that the newer iterations replace what then becomes instantly or in very short order outdated media
Exactly.
technologies.
Right.
And
And the way of overcoming it is simply by embracing the new.
right.
And you do that, and scholars can do, they don't have to proclaim that, but they can, just by their particular emphases, end up sort of privileging, sometimes unconsciously. That's one of the things they point out, that sometimes scholars just sort of unconsciously um, focus on new media in a way that it suggests that anything prior to that particular avatar or modality of media is just, why are we even talking about it? It's the new thing that is the
Mm-hmm.
cutting edge and that is important. So that's one. So how do they overcome it, Michael? I mean, I tried to explain it, but I bet you can explain it better. How do they try to overcome that old new media?
Well, I think so. The goal, what's the term? Mediation, right? And then
Right,
remediation. And the
right,
idea
right.
is that, and this, so I think it's important to note, and we mentioned this last time, but this is, I think an important thing is that this was a 2012 article
Sure,
or
right.
2012
Yeah, I'm
chapter,
glad you
excuse
brought
me.
that up.
And so we had talked about this last time, I believe, but this is really at the beginning of the sort of shift to new materialism as a theoretical lens, and actor network theory. And it's interesting that a lot of the big voices there are absent here. And I think that is the answer to how to deal with it, is to start looking at new media and old media as part of an ecology, and to sort of to step outside of time and look at these things as
Right,
mutually informing each other.
right,
And
right.
I think it's I mean, obviously I'm partial to this perspective, but um, I think it's a lens that from a certain perspective is really hard to get to.
Uh-huh.
If you're going to sit here and say, well, how is it that you're going to try and just to name two technologies that are sort of spatial, that are temporally spaced, how are you going to square the VCR with streaming, as an example, right? Like these two are obviously, one is the result of a series of technological evolutions. How can we look at these two as being mutually informative? But I think the answer is really to look at them as networks that mutually
hmm
inform each other, and and if you can sort of run the stream backwards or in any direction other than just straight ahead, I think it's a productive way of looking at things.
Well, as you know, they don't articulate network theory,
No.
surprisingly enough, but that's the kind of tendency where they want to go. I mean,
Yes.
what they want to resist progressive thinking, and insofar as actor network theory about media evolution. And so, insofar as they do that, they end up being sort of congruent with actor network theory.
Hmm.
And let me, because I think we're, and actually in some of the things you were just saying about how they're sort of rethinking how Kember and Zylinska are trying to rethink the impasse or divide between old and new media, and trying to think about that difference in a new way that gives respect to all the components, to the old and the new. Let me mention the other major binary structural
Absolutely.
impasse in the field, and I'm not going to dwell on it because I think we're about to uh, kind of organically make our transition to, um, our task in this episode, which is to talk through their major solution to the problems of the
Hmm.
impasses.
Hmm.
So I don't want to spend too much time on that. Although, plug for our last episode, I think we talked about this last impasse a lot in our previous episode. And the last impasse or binary that Kember and Zylinska are trying to overcome. Well, basically, the impasse is two critical names can sort of stand in for these they're emblematic of these two approaches. So two friends of the program.
Hmm.
Although these two friends of the program, we couldn't bring them in the bar together with us. They probably wouldn't go in the bar together with us. And the friends of the program, of course, are Marshall McLuhan and Raymond Williams, who, as Kember and Zylinska note, come to stand for an opposing position on media studies. So Williams, and Kember and Zylinska are, in a sense, perhaps being reductive for both of these thinkers, but they're trying to do an intervention. I'm going to cut them some slack. But for the purposes of this essay, Raymond Williams basically stands for social constructionist and or Marxist interpretations of media. So that Williams stands for a perspective in media studies that says that technology is not its own free agent. We can't talk about technology as having agency because technology is, well, it's part of the mode of production. It's determined by the mode of production, just like every effing thing else, right? So, in a certain way, Williams' productivist metaphor and constructionist views places him in the humanist camp. So Kember and Zylinska say, and Kember and Zylinska notes that for many years, that position really kind of dominated media studies and communication studies. So people were looking at human ends and means. People were referring to economic policies and government policies and state policies to try and make sense of media trajectories. And for Williams, as a Marxist, he would follow the money and say, well, what is capitalism? What's it doing with technology? That's going to tell you a lot about technology. That's going to tell you, and in fact, we talked about this, I think, in our episode on Williams and television. If help me jog my memory, Michael. There was the stunning passage early in the book where he's talking about all these 19th century technologies, and his big point is that a lot of them lay dormant.
Right.
A lot of them, and some of them never get capitalized on and never. So what happens? Well, what happens, he says, is that state government, oftentimes, it's not private corporations, but state governments that get interested in certain technologies, they bankroll it, and lo and behold, we have a new technology. So technology seems to be secondary, and what seems to be primary are state forces and economic forces in tandem, right? So that's Williams. So what's on the other side? It's our dear friend Marshall, Marshall McLuhan, who, in Kember and Zylinska's view, came to stand for an opposing view that for many years was took the backseat to the humanist slash Marxist view of social constructionists like Williams. And in this view, technology is its own damn thing. Technology has its own agency. And in fact, the criticism, the reason why McLuhan was largely dismissed beginning in the 70s, after his huge emergence and definitional role in the field in the starting in the mid 60s. In the 70s and certainly in the 80s and beyond, McLuhan's star shone less brightly. Shone or shined? Shined less brightly, right? Oh my God.
Oh,
Okay, I'm
very.
not an
I'm
English
staying
major.
clear
Thank
of this
God.
one, sir.
Anyway, it was less bright. How about that? It
Yeah,
was
there you
just
go.
less bright. And it was less bright for this reason. He was tagged with a term. He was de defined and dismissed as a techno-determinist, as someone who was looking at, and this was very specifically Williams' major problem with McLuhan, is that Williams just said he's not paying attention to economics. It's
Right.
like technology is doing all its stuff by itself. That's not the case. And even non-Marxists or other social constructionists would say McLuhan is allowing technology too much agency and acting as if it totally determines the human sphere, economic sphere, and social spheres. So
Yeah.
they're looking for a third way beyond it. So they say, now, interestingly, and I have to say this endears them to me. Um, they do say that, perhaps McLuhan got an unfair shake and that, his techno-determinism was exaggerated. But their main purpose in talking about this binary, as in the other binary, is not to champion one pole over another, but to find a third way. And that kind of brings us to what we're going to
To
talk
where
about.
we are. Yeah, I think that first of all, I think that's a really helpful introduction into what we're doing today. Um, the I'm gonna put it in my own words to just get us rolling here, but I have a couple questions for your
Oh,
interpretation of this. No, no, no.
I'm
I think
trembling. I'm trembling.
so.
I'm a man of
Williams,
weak nerves.
the Kember Zylinska position, their
Yeah,
framing of this is basically to say
yeah.
there's a tension between Williams and McLuhan, and that
It ended up
ultimately
determining, but this is important. That
exactly, that
ended
ended
up
up
determining the
determining
field.
the way that
Yeah,
the field
yeah,
looks at
yeah,
media.
absolutely.
So it's
Absolutely.
basically you reach this crossroad and you've got these two heavyweight voices, and the question is, well, who are we going to follow? Who are we going to listen to? Williams' position is really framing media technologies as tools, essentially,
Cool.
that
Indeed.
are taken up at the behest of human agents, government agents, to, and I think what we were talking about in the Williams episode was really to essentially solve problems, right? Or
Indeed.
to address issues that we have. So
Mhm.
this is a the one side. And with McLuhan, I don't, and I think this might seem like a pedantic
Mm,
differentiation, but
mhm,
but I think it's kind of important.
mhm,
For some, I'll see if I can articulate why. I don't know that his position is so much that the media technologies have agency
mhm,
as it is that they are agentive. And to me, the difference there lies in one of the big misconceptions around network theory, which is this question of consciousness or intentionality. The question, really, the tension between Williams and McLuhan is, are these benign tools or do they have an active influence? And the question that, and to that end, Williams wins out, I think, because it's a safer, less threatening position, quite frankly. If we can say, we're going to put all this in the hands of capitalist interests, we're going to drive ourselves forward, there is no threat if there is no influence. This is a safe process to
We're
go
in the
on.
driver's seat, and whether you're an anti-capitalist or a capitalist, you want to be in the
And
driver's seat.
right, right. But see, I think that question about control becomes interesting later when we talk about the rapid development of these things. We'll see
Mhm,
where our
mhm,
conversation goes with
mhm,
that.
mhm.
But the basic argument is that Williams wins in terms of what's the predominant lens going to be. That we look
Right.
at media technologies as tools, human agency is preserved, human intentionality is preserved. Um, their goal, and this is, I think, where we left off, is to really present a position where we can say, hey, or their thesis is that we are co-evolving with our media, that
Mhm,
we
mhm,
influence the media as the media influences us, which I think is part of the reason why it's important to lay flat and step outside this question of time is the defining metric and progress is pointing in one direction, because this way we can look at the mutual influence, I think, more effectively.
mhm, mhm, mhm,
So the question is, how do we talk about this mutual influence, this coevolution?
mhm.
And they turn to our two other dear friends
Who could be in the bar together,
who
as long
could
as they don't talk about politics.
right, right. And as long as all weapons are left outside at the door. So we enter Martin Heidegger and Bernard Stiegler. Um, so shall we jump in? I think this is really the plan. So first of all, thank you for your patience and letting us set the table this far, right? The plan at this point is just to sort of run through and talk about some of the
Yeah.
interesting ideas here.
Yeah.
And
Well,
so
this
to
is going to be the solution, and we're going to try to talk through their proposed way, their proposed third way. I think that's what's going on here, right?
yeah, it's how do you articulate what that
Mhm,
third
mhm.
position looks like? And so they
Right,
they
right.
they they call on our two dear friends. And so I'll read the first section, Barry, and feel free to interrupt. But
Let's do it.
the point, I guess,
Let's do it.
to just to set one last thing on the table here.
Mhm.
The argument here they're picking up is how do we discuss McLuhan's position, which is the idea that we are evolving with our technologies and that there is a mutual influence back and forth.
Sure.
This is trying
Yeah,
to get away.
sure.
This is trying, I don't want to say trying to get away from Williams so much as maybe this is trying to bring McLuhan back to a equally footed
Hmm.
position in the conversation.
I think that very nicely actually summarizes their closing position in the last section of the essay where we stopped in the last
Right.
episode. So yeah, but that's well put.
Okay. So this gets very Heideggerian, and we will try and be as clear as possible. I will probably ask you, Barry, for help. In his offsite, so this is Kember and Zylinska. In his off-cited essay, The Question Concerning Technology, Heidegger bemoans the fact that in modern times, technology has been reduced to the way for humans to organize nature and bring it under their command. So again, technology as a tool to dominate nature.
Sure.
This way of ordering, quote, demands that nature be orderable as a standing reserve. This process of enframing is also a concealing because for Heidegger, it removes us from the more creative, less instrumental relationship with technology we had in the past, which this particular philosopher, like many others, locates in ancient Greece. So just let's stop for a second, because if you're
Yes,
not familiar
indeed.
with Heidegger, this is really, this can get
Yes,
muddy
indeed.
quickly. The argument is that we are, through our use of tools, we seek to harness the power of nature. We dominate nature and create what he calls the standing reserve, which essentially is, how would you say, like a potential for future domination, right? For
Nature, okay, the standing reserve becomes a potential for, yes, human domination over nature.
over nature,
That's
right?
the problem, is that nature is a common preserve,
Right.
but the human insistence is that nature be orderable as a standing reserve for human potentiality
Right. So the problem for Heidegger is that we utilize technology to dominate
to
nature,
dominate,
which
right?
is bad.
Which is not
We
good,
don't want to be doing that.
which is not good.
The historical, so back to Kember and Zylinska, the historical accuracy of this designation aside,
Oh, but
what,
Michael, before you continue with that, I
yeah,
just want to put a pin in that sentence that you just finished reading.
okay.
Because, in fact, I'll just read the part of the sentence that I wanted to put a pin in. I'm not going to talk about it long. But I will say that not only, I'll read that second sentence again. This process of enframing is also a concealing because for Heidegger, it removes us from the more creative instrumental relationship, less instrumental. That's important,
Yes.
less instrumental relationship with technology that we had in the past. Now, Michael is going to continue reading this passage and we're going to continue explicating Heidegger. But that last bit also stands in for Steigler. So I just wanted to
Mhm.
put it in it because Steigler too looks not just to the Greeks, but also to the Greeks. But in general, Steigler will look to even beyond the Greeks or farther past the Greeks to early hominizations, right? Early hominid species, and note the ways in which earlier human species are writing on cave walls.
Mhm.
We'll pay attention to mathematical notation. He also finds more creative, less instrumental relationships in Greece, as Heidegger does, but really in the prehistoric world.
Mhm.
That's part of Stiegler's project too.
Okay. So what Heidegger achieves by this excursion to the Greeks is excavating the original meaning of technology as techne and poiesis. That is, bringing forth and presencing. Technology for Heidegger is therefore an inherently world-forming process. So, do you want to take a crack at this, or do you want me to?
I'll just take a quick track of world forming process. For our purposes, It's a big, as you know, I'm sure you were trembling like I was when we get to world forming processes. Oh no, we have to talk about it. But for our purposes, I have an idea of something that will, I think, satisfy listeners and allow us to continue in short order. Um, the important emphasis in this idea of world forming processes is that if one thinks about technology as forming a world,
Hmm.
it's no longer about the human instrumental use of nature. It is about creating a world where technology, the human, and nature coexist.
It is ecological.
Thank
Right.
you.
So it is bringing forth and presencing. It is being in that world as opposed. So this is a shift away from dominance.
Shift away from
This
dominance
is
and
about
humanism. It's where it sort of anticipates the actor network theory
right.
that it's moving away from a human-centered view.
So yes, they are leaning into Heidegger, leaning into the Greeks for techne and poiesis as a way of saying that these two things coexist in a way that creates a whole. Okay.
Wonderful. Yeah,
So moving forward, yet this process, the process of bringing forth and presencing, and human participation in it are now seriously constrained. In the words of Mark Poster, and this is a quote, as a result of the unconscious quality of modern humans' relation to their framing of things, they do not perceive the setting up of the scene in which they act and take their own cultural shapes. Consequently, our own being in the world is invisible to us. In other words,
you're quoting. Let's
I'm
mention
quoting
to the
Poster there.
listener.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry,
you're
or
quoting
they're
Post.
quoting Poster
They're
there.
quoting. Yeah,
The argument there is that this the modern version of this bringing forth and presencing has pushed human consciousness and intentionality to the forefront again, and we have lost sight of the coexistence in our nature, that we've privileged ourselves over
sure.
the tools that we use. Excuse me. Consequently, our own being in the world is invisible to us. It is Heidegger's ambition to restore our original relationship with this technology, again, through techne and poiesis, which will also be a way for us to live a more conscious and more free life. You with me?
I am with you, and I just make a quick comment here
Yeah.
again on Heidegger, but basically my comment on Heidegger, you're doing so well in sort of explicating Heidegger. My comment is just going to be another attempt to. I'm going to try to yet again. I will note the ways in which the way they Kimber and Zylinska articulate the Heideggerian project sounds a lot like the Stieglerian project. Now,
Mhm.
Heidegger has a thing about the Greeks and Heidegger's ambition to restore an original relationship, a pure relationship with technology that was lost. Now, I don't think Stiegler uh, wants that. I mean, he's not as concerned about purity and authenticity as Heidegger is. However, this idea of rethinking the modern and criticizing the contemporary instantiation of technology as a privileging of the human over world forming processes. I think Siegler is very inspired by Heidegger in that.
I would agree with that. I don't think the difference, I think, again, is you just mentioned, Heidegger is looking for sort of a pure essence. I think
Yes, right, right,
that's
right,
not Stiegler's job
right,
at
right,
all here.
right, right.
All right. So, significantly, when Heidegger declares that the essence of technology is by no means anything technological, he is not retreating to some kind of pre-technicist utopia where man used to be at one with the nature. I'll finish before I
Do
say
you
anything.
agree with that, Michael? Do you agree with that?
I Give me a second, and then give me a second. So he's not returning to any pre-technicist utopia where man used to be at one with nature. For
Uh-huh.
him, and here's your answer. This is why I wanted to wait. For
Okay.
him, we always remain chained to technology, whether we passionately affirm it or deny
Well,
it.
yeah. Okay. All right.
So
Okay. You saved him. You saved him. Okay. I was about to say that, sometimes he does have that yearning to be a one, but no,
but
no.
the reason it would feel that way,
Mhm.
dear friend, is
Hmm.
because you have lost sight of our position and again
Uh-huh.
edged yourself forward, right?
Oh,
There is a
I see.
harmonious interaction, like to be with nature.
Uh,
If you think about it, what does that mean? It from a human perspective, that kind of means to dominate it. You know,
uh,
what am I going to do if I'm going to be one with human nature, with not human nature,
uh,
excuse me. If I'm going to be one with nature, I'm going to go out in the woods. I'm going to cut a tree down. I'm going to start a fire and I'm going to go camp and be like, isn't this lovely? But I just tried to dominate nature, right? So I think that, and in cutting that tree down, I'm existing. And so I think Heidegger is basically saying, look, let's just sort of understand that we are uh, co-constructive of a whole here. That
right,
it's
right, right, right.
it's I think it and his point. So in this situation, if I'm reading him correctly, I absolutely agree with it. I think if you aren't careful, it's very easy to push yourself forward and then to create nature as the standing reserve, and that seems to be his mission to avoid here.
Hmm.
This is more than just a comment on our spiritual and physical slavery to the forces beyond us, is taken up by Steigler's reading of Heidegger. This notion points to our originary technicity, our way of being and emerging with technology. I am going to leave that term, originary technicity, to you. I have a take on it, but I'm going to.
Well, I'll try and give my take quickly. So I'm interested to hear your take on it. But I've already sort of uh, played my card in this when I was talking about Stiegler's interest and his use of anthropology to give a scientific material basis to Heidegger's speculations about humans and technology. And basically, so um, like Heidegger, the upshot of Stiegler's forays into anthropology, and I'm talking about physical anthropology here, uh, the purpose is to get around a binary, and the binary would be the human and the technological. And the way he strives to overcome that is that for Stiegler, um, the evolution of humanity is quite literally a co-product of technological evolution, so that it becomes impossible to articulate a meaningful difference between human evolution and technological evolution. The advances, quote unquote, the developments, I'll use that word, less loaded word, the developments are so commingled, coterminous, that it becomes impossible to say, well, technology is creating the human. No, the humans are creating the technology. They both transform each other. And like I said, the point of the anthropological argument is to say there's scientific basis for this, that every time humans emerge as what we would call now the human, that is only because there is a tool or a technology present. At the very least, there is always a writing machine, a memory machine. There is something that will stand in for memory. So, and that every definition of the human, that including current definitions of the human, they're impossible to separate from a historical point of view, from an anthropological point of view, from the developments in tools. We can't separate them. So originary technicity means that well, my read of it would be the origins of the human consists not in humanity as an essence, but in its technicity, in human technicity. That's the origin of the human. So you can't oppose the two because the
No,
terms don't make any sense
as isolated from
as
each other.
isolated terms. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Okay. I'm gonna leave that, but
What was your take? What was your take?
well,
You sound like
you
maybe.
just raised a really big question for me. So much
Oh.
I think my take is exactly the same as yours. That original technicity
Mhm.
refers to the idea that humans are both creators of and users
Yeah.
of technology, and that in creating and using, we are shaped by technology. And as we are shaped, our technologies are shaped. So you have this circle, essentially, where one influences the other and essentially become meaningless, divorced from each other. What
I,
you
I,
said,
oh yeah. Now, if you're going to ask a question, let me just interrupt you briefly. I'm skipping to page 15, and I'm just going to read two sentences from Heidegger that I think totally state what you just said, and what I was trying to say.
okay, I've got my question written down because this is
Okay.
yeah.
Well, so I just want to I just want to end this final chapter here, and then we'll
We're
move on
not
to the
ending
other.
anything, buddy.
Well, all right. Heidegger is thus prefiguring here Steigler's thesis of originary technicity. And here is the definition given. And interestingly enough, Kember and Zylinska are using Heidegger
Right,
to define Steigler, right?
right.
So there is technological force at work in the universe that is a challenging, that's very Heideggerian,
Yes.
um, and that gathers man into ordering. Note, man is not doing the ordering.
It is the technology.
Right, right. That is gathering man into an ordering that encompasses man, human, and the technology. As a result, the human has to, quote, this is the reason why I was saying the notion of originary technicity is about the commingling of human and technological. As a result, the human has to, quote, Heidegger here, has to, quote, respond to the call of unconcealment, even when he contradicts it.
Okay. So I'm glad you did that.
All
And
right.
I'm glad that they sought to work backwards and use Heidegger to define
Stiegler.
Steigler. And I'm glad that this is written in English, not German, because I'm going to try and use these versions of the word here because you said something that was really interesting to me that I hadn't considered before now.
Hmm.
You had mentioned that throughout history, where there is the human, there is the technological, and the two
Oh,
are combined. And you had mentioned that the technology is always a stand-in for memory. And I had never thought of that before. And so the question that immediately jumped forward was Plato's disdain for writing as a
sure.
technology because it took the place of memory. It
Right,
relieved us
right.
of the burden of memory. But here, when they quote Heidegger, and they say there's a technological force at work in the universe that is a challenging and that gathers man into ordering, right? So that this sort of shapes man. As a result, the human has to respond to the call of unconcealment. Now, this is I think going a little. This is a deeper cut into the Heideggerian language, but this notion of unconcealment is an implication that it's not a creation, it is a revelation. In other words, that
Absolutely.
what is there has always been there. In other words, it is a version of memory. You could argue that this is a stand-in for memory here.
Sure.
We are
Absolutely.
revealing what already exists
Right,
via
right.
the technological. So I guess maybe the question was platonic in the sense that what like do we, I don't
Oh, it's
maybe we don't.
Plato language because unconcealment, it gets back to the Greek aletheia, I think, is how
Just
you would
truth,
pronounce
right?
it. Huh?
That
Truth.
yeah, yeah.
Right. So unconcealment equals truth.
So no, but how do
It's
we
not a truth but it's not a truth you're creating. It's a truth you're revealing,
right rediscovering, if you will.
rediscovering. Right.
Right. And so it's an I guess what I'm saying is I hadn't, maybe it's not so much a question, it's just an observation that um this duality and the tension between the human
Yeah.
uh, is fairly deeply rooted in these discussions.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I guess I hadn't thought about it in terms of uh, media, but here we go. Okay, shall we move on?
Let's round the bend and let's bring this boat into the harbor, shall we? Let's let's bring this into the harbor.
Go
I'm trying to
sailing,
use
baby.
nautical metaphors because we're in Florida right now. Um, because we wanted to talk about the contemporary, right?
Yep. So we go from um
The current moment we wanted to talk about.
yes. So do you want to read this section?
I can, if you want, if you would like me to, I will. So we wanted to sort of talk through this last passage, and I guess we wonder now, so just in terms of Kember and Zylinska.
Actually,
Oh, I'm sorry.
no, I'm sorry. There's just before we get to the last section, there's this little middle section
Do you want to go there? Why
that I
don't you
do.
do that, and then
Well,
I'll
I
do the
think
last one.
this is a nice transition
Okay,
into Stiegler, and
let's do that.
it's fairly lucid. So they say, and maybe we'll have something to say about it. Technology is positioned here as a force that brings man forth and is fully active in the process of harmonization. And that's what we've been talking
Yeah,
about
that's what
so
I've been
far.
talking about.
It is not just an external device that can be picked up, appended, and then be discarded at
Yeah,
will. And that is the argument against technology as a tool. That is moving away from
there you
Williams
go.
and towards McLuhan, in other words.
Right, right.
For Stiegler, the human drive towards exteriorization, right? And this is when he's talking about when they're talking about exteriorization, they're talking about away from the human in towards
Hmm.
the technological,
Hmm.
towards tools, fire, and other prostheses, towards techne, in other words, right? So that's
Hmm.
back to the Greek, is due to a technical
Which is, we
tendency.
should say, we should define what it is. Techne is a craft. It's like a way of making, right?
Right, right.
And Heidegger's big point is that the word that it's the basis of technology is also the word for poetry in
Now,
Greek.
and what's interesting here as well as we're talking, remember this is rooted in this tension between Williams and McLuhan.
Hmm.
Listen to this sentence. For Stiegler, the human drive towards exteriorization, towards tools, fire, and other prostheses. This was Williams's big thing, was the idea that technology is a prosthetic, essentially. I mean, this we've talked about
Yes.
this before with the mediumist massage and the massage. Uh, towards techne, in other words, is due to a technical tendency that is embedded in the older zoological dynamic, a tendency that was arguably already identified by Heidegger.
Although what's different from Williams is this idea that the human, in order to be human, has this inherent tendency that includes the not human, the technological. So that's the difference.
Oh yeah, no. When I mentioned Williams, I was simply talking. What I meant by that
Or the idea that
was that these
technology, yeah,
tools could
yeah,
be
yeah,
picked up and put down. That they were
yes, yes,
fully
yes, right,
exterior to us. It is not
yes,
that is
yes,
not that. So they've
yes,
identified
yeah,
a third position now that is very McLuhan heavy.
yeah,
Um,
gotcha.
okay, yeah.
Thanks for going back to that passage. I just am a little jealous of Kember and Zylinska because I was trying to, I think I rambled on for 10 minutes just to do that one sentence that technology is positioned as a force that brings humans forth and is fully active in the process of harmonization. That's a wonderful summary of Stiegler's take on technics.
Shall we move?
Please.
Okay. Do you want to talk about this last section, Barry?
Sure, I'll read it. And I think we wanted to end here because not only was this an interesting articulation of the solution, and like I said, the Kemper-Zylinska solution, and that's basically what's happening in this particular section. We're not going to have a chance to talk about it, and it's partly because we don't quite understand it. But also Bergson, nobody heard that, right?
It's never
Um,
said.
we didn't really talk about it, but Bergson is also mentioned as a thinker here, and we don't have time to talk about it. We could talk about, oh, Michael, could we not talk about it? We
Look
could
at
talk
the
about it
time
all
fly,
day.
Barry.
But
I
look at
would.
the clock.
Oh my
We have
God.
time to talk about
It
Bergson.
was. It was terrible.
It's really sad, and our heart is broken. But anyway, um,
We'll do what we
I,
can to salvage the episode by stopping here, though.
right. But anyway, to be fair to Kemper and Zylinska, they use three thinkers to sort of light the way out of light the way and create a clearing, a way for them to fall up outside the binary. And it's Heidegger, Stiegler, and Bergson. We mostly focused on Heidegger and Stiegler, especially in this episode, but we're going to end with a passage that maybe, I don't know, does it tug a little bit against Stiegler and Heidegger? Maybe it does. Let's see.
We'll see.
Oh, I'm supposed to read it. So let me read it and we'll see how it goes. What is, however, significant about the current moment? And we were interested in this passage, right? Because Kember and now, as you mentioned earlier, Michael, as you reminded us, the current moment in this case is about 10 years ago or more.
Yeah, but this
But
still plays. I think that what's
Mhm.
interesting about this, when you think about technological and media development,
Uh-huh.
right? There is a rapid acceleration that takes place with the rise of the internet,
Sure.
right? And it's Moore's law, right?
Yeah.
And
Mhm.
I think that that originates, I think, in the 50s or 60s, but
Yes, it
we
does.
see it take place here.
In the 90s
And
and
well,
aughts.
yeah. And so though
In the aughts.
this is pre new materialism, this is pre actor network theory, the idea is still as good now as it was then. I mean, I don't think this hasn't aged at all.
So their current moment,
It's still
that
our
we're
current
is
moment,
still
is
our
it?
current moment. Because they are really are talking about the nascent digital moment. That's
Yeah,
the
yeah.
difference. Yeah.
And when you talk about, I quite frankly, when we talk, I mean, we should probably just shut up and read it. But when we talk about the rapid acceleration,
Yeah.
things have not slowed down since
No,
2012.
no. And in fact, AI has accelerated in the last, that is just one example of many of this acceleration that we're talking about. So
And
let's
just as one
oh
last
yeah.
point, we probably
Yeah,
could have
please.
talked about Bergson if we hadn't had to have that whole two
Oh
minutes
yeah.
of
Yeah, yeah,
throat
exactly.
clearing.
Of
So
course. Of
sorry again.
course. Sorry, Henri. What is, however, significant about the current moment? I'm reading from Kember and Zylinska here. And by current, Steigler refers to, that's right. They're working through Stiegler's
That's
interpretation of
right.
the digital moment. That's right. What is, however, significant about the current moment, and by current, Stiegler refers to the modern period inaugurated by the Industrial Revolution of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, is the speed of technological development. Okay, so we have to revise what we were saying. The current moment is a moment that really begins with the acceleration of industrial technology,
Hmm.
but that, the acceleration has been the mode of technological development since the Industrial Revolution, continuing into the digital revolution. So the current moment means the contemporary moment, but also is gesturing backwards. But Siegler feels we can do that with justice, with some justice, gesturing backward 100 years ago, because there's that same feeling of accelerated pace, that technology seems to be autonomous simply because it is changing and morphing seemingly on its own, right? Okay.
Hmm.
It has increased exponentially over the last 2 centuries, getting out of sync with the speed of the development of other areas of life: social, cultural, spiritual, legal, and so on. We can talk about COVID as an accelerator. We could talk about 9/11 as an accelerator, right? We could think of a lot of different accelerators. Um, I'm just throwing that out there. Would you agree with me, Michael? Is COVID also part of an accelerator?
Well, again, I think
I
it
mean,
depends.
COVID is a mediated, I mean, it's a virus, but it's mediated, right? It's mediated.
It is absolutely an accelerator. All things are, because all again, we have to step out of the notion that we are working on a one way progress only timeline,
Mhm,
right? So
mhm.
if you look at something like COVID was an accelerator, sure, look what it did for vaccines.
Sure.
And that's not to say that's the direction in which it accelerated. It
Yeah,
is simply to
yeah.
say that is a direction. So yes, I think all things are accelerants, because again, the third position here is arguing that we need to look at the way that all medias coexist,
Mhm.
and that all media are co-influential in an ecological sense as opposed to a linear sense.
All right, I'll continue. This acceleration of the technological development, which is evidenced in the emergence of machinic production, sorry, railway networks, computation, cybernetics, and last but not least, globalization, has serious consequences for the philosophical order that has been in place since Plato and the Greeks. It is precisely this order that has allowed for the emergence of a hegemonic consensus in modernity, a consensus that sees technics as having no ontological sense, as only an artifice that must be separated from being. So even though we have always been technological, a radical change has taken place over the last century, with the speed of technological transformation and intensity of technical production constantly increasing and getting ahead of the development of other spheres of life. Let me take a quick take on what's going on here. This in particular, it seems to be articulating Steigler's specific contribution to this particular debate and is an attempt to articulate and Kember and Zylinska are articulating this in order to align with it. You have a sense, Steigler is not just, he is a philosopher of recovery. We talked about the um, Steigler who seems to be following in Heidegger's footsteps and sort of rethinking ancient philosophy and thinking about the hominid ancestors who were using tools or using tools as memory machines. So there is a recovery aspect to him. But the other part, and I think our most recent episodes on Steigler touches on this, there is Steigler, the diagnosed, he's the therapist of modern neuroses because mostly he feels that acceleration has stripped life of meaning and that it has technology, that this technological acceleration that Kember and Zylinska are describing. Steigler uses the old-fashioned word and says, well, what's the result of this? Kind of an old-fashioned spiritual crisis. There is a meaning gap, a meaning absence because of the accelerated rate of technology. And so Steigler feels that philosophers of techne have to become therapists of this new culture and try to find ways to overcome these spiritual maladies.
I agree. And the problem is that, and this is something, so as I got to this part, um, when Automatic Society was written after this, correct?
Sure, right,
Okay,
right.
so a lot of what I guess Stiegler's later writing, and we talked about this in some of the very, very early episodes when we were really digging into Stiegler, this idea about, we linked him with Jonathan Crary in 24/7, and basically the dominant conversation that you and I had for a long time around Stiegler in his work that comes after this was societies have become these always on
Right,
machines, if you
right,
will,
right.
that are encouraging us to remain perpetually plugged in, turned on. And that the answer to this problem, in terms of how does the philosopher manage this, right, is what he called noesis, or stepping out,
Mhm.
but a moment of reflection. And the problem that we have, if we look at it through Kember and Zylinska's lens, is that our technologies are advancing much
Master.
more
Right,
rapidly than
right.
we are able to contemplate them. And so if we go back to Heidegger for this idea of, the technology and the human coexisting, of bringing forth, and uh, we can't make sense of ourselves.
Right.
And so we are created we have created, or we find ourselves in a mutually created. I have to be careful how I think about this here. We find ourselves in this situation where we are foreign to ourselves.
Mhm,
And
mhm.
I think it's fascinating because, you had asked just a few minutes ago, would you consider something like COVID an accelerant? Right? And absolutely. And it's an interesting one because look at how much absolute confusion came out of this. And we can argue, well, it's because of political maneuvering or it's because of a certain degree of malfeasance by some actors, whatever. But it doesn't matter because they're all still a part of this
Yeah. Yeah.
ecology that we have. And so it
Right.
seems like the further we rocket forward, and this again is, it's problematic to talk about this timely because they want us to look backwards as well as forwards. But just, bear with me for a second. As we continue to co-evolve, we become less certain of who, what, where, how. All of these things that create a sense of stability are eroded. And it seems like to me, Stiegler's answer for this becomes increasingly difficult to not just comprehend, but also to implement. And we've seen other thinkers, Byung-Chul Han is the first one that comes to mind here, talking about how to sort of try and step outside or around or
Mhm.
create space. But the problem that I'm realizing here is that to try and create that space, and tell me if I'm going in the wrong place here or a bad place here, to try and create that space seems to me to be very similar to saying to try and create a human centric, non technological,
Right.
sort of
No,
niche
I think
that
that's a challenge. Yeah.
that is
Yes.
that's not entirely possible.
No, I think you hit the nub of it. And this is a good closing point because I think um
I didn't mean to
this
talk too much there, but I'm sorry, but it was
no, no, I don't think I loved I thought that was a brilliant summation statement. And I just want to add a little marble to the pack here. Michael, I think you perfectly summed up really what the Heideggerian Stieglerian challenge to modern media studies is um, Stiegler especially, but of course Heidegger equates a certain formula, a certain way of thinking about the human technological relation. They equate it with modernity and they equate it with dystopia and environmental crisis and domination and all manner of bad things. And there's always the temptation and maybe to a certain extent, Heidegger kind of succumbed to this temptation because, there was a guy who kind of went out and lived in the woods in his later years and sort of embraced a kind of retreat from the world. But Stiegler never did that. And as one of our wonderful listeners pointed out, Stiegler had a pedagogic project. Stiegler was engaged was interested in diagnosing the psychological ills and burdens of technology, but he never urged for a kind of retreat. And I think the reason why is precisely what you said, that a simple retreat actually misses the ancient point, the point of the ancient wisdom that both Stiegler and Heidegger were trying to recover. And the ancient wisdom was not about the centrality of the human, but about world-forming processes that encompass the human, the technological, and and nature, right?
Mhm.
So the problem with if we diagnose and prayer, not to, I don't want to use Crary or anyone as my whipping post in this particular thing, but I'll just say that a simple critique, a critique that is a prelude to a retreat into the human, Stiegler, I mean, that seems to go against Stiegler and Heidegger at their core. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. But I also don't even know if it's possible.
Oh,
But that's a different discussion.
you mean you don't think it's possible to actually retreat into this pure realm? Yeah, I wouldn't think it is either. Or did you mean something else by
No,
retrieve?
no. I mean, I think that becomes a sort of semantic argument in the sense now that maybe we can start parsing out what we mean by technologies and where do we
Sure,
stop and the others begin.
sure.
But if you want to get sort of, I just I don't know. I think that this is this idea. And look, I'm seduced by fancy ideas fairly easily. I'm not a complicated fellow, Barry. I hop on the shiniest ideas and ride with them. But this is a really interesting argument that I think has quite a bit to say about the current condition,
Sure.
and it is compelling in ways that you really see. I mean, you see echoes of this problem articulated in a number of places. And as we've talked about in various different ways, the answer to these problems is always more technology to solve the problems brought on by technologies. And it's like this balance has gotten out of
Mhm.
whack.
Mhm.
Well, this was uplifting, Barry.
Oh, well, I don't think we got into a grim moment here. I think we were just saying that the philosopher has to be balanced. That's
Yeah.
really what's going on here. That more technology is not the answer, and more human is not the answer, right?
Well, I think that the attempt to divorce the two
Right, exactly.
is
That's
is
right.
is a folly. And
And that seems to be the position that Steigler and Heidegger and then Kember and Zylinska are embracing, right?
mhm. So the question maybe then isn't, maybe more human is the answer somehow.
If you realize the human is technological, absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, Barry, technologically and humanly, I appreciate you.
I feel, I feel you, Michael. I appreciate you.
All
I
right. I
see
will.
you. I
We'll
see
do.
you.
I see you, sir. And we will do this again soon.
All right. See you.
Take care.
Thanks for listening to the Critical Media Studies podcast. To find out more about the show, check out our webpage at criticalmediastudiespodcast.com.